The Story of the Spanish Armada, by Alfred H. Miles. By Sir Edward Crasy. On the afternoon of July 19th, a group of English captains was collected at the Bowling Green on the Hoe at Plymouth, whose equals have never before or since been brought together, even at that favourite mustering place of the heroes of the British Navy. There was Sir Francis Drake, the first English circumnavigator of the globe, the terror of every Spanish coast in the Old World and the New. There was Sir John Hawkins, the rough veteran of many a daring voyage on the African and American seas, and of many a desperate battle. There was Sir Martin Frobisher, one of the earliest explorers of the Arctic seas in search of that northwest passage, which is still the darling object of England's boldest mariners. There was the High Admiral of England, Lord Howard of Effingham, prodigal of all things in his country's cause, and who had recently had the noble daring to refuse to dismantle part of the fleet, though the Queen had sent him orders to do so, resolved to risk his sovereign's anger, and to keep the ships afloat at his own charge, rather than that England should run the peril of losing their protection. A match at bowls was being played, in which Drake and other high officers of the fleet were engaged, when a small armed vessel was seen running before the wind into Plymouth harbour, with all sails set. Her commander landed in haste, and eagerly sought the place where the English Lord Admiral and his captains were standing. His name was Fleming. He was the master of a Scotch privateer, and he told the English officers that he had that morning seen the Spanish Armada off the Cornish coast. At this exciting information the captains began to hurry down to the water, and there was a shouting for the ship's boats, but Drake coolly checked his comrades, and insisted that the match should be played out. He said that there was plenty of time both to win the game and beat the Spaniards. The best and bravest match that ever was scored was resumed accordingly. Drake and his friends aimed their last bowls with the same steady calculating coolness with which they were about to point their guns. The winning cast was made, and then they went on board and prepared for action, with their hearts as light and their nerves as firm as they had been on the Hoe Bowling Green. Meanwhile, the messengers and signals had been dispatched fast and far through England, to warn each town and village that the enemy had come at last. In every seaport there was instant making ready by land and by sea. In every shire and every city there was instant mustering of horse and man, but England's best defence then, as ever, was her fleet. And after warping laboriously out of Plymouth harbour against the wind, the Lord Admiral stood westward under easy sail, keeping an anxious look-out for the Armada, the approach of which was soon announced by Cornish fishing boats, and signals from the Cornish cliffs. The England of our own days is so strong, and the Spain of our own days is so feeble, that it is not possible, without some reflection and care, to comprehend the full extent of the peril which England then ran from the power and the ambition of Spain, or to appreciate the importance of that crisis in the history of the world. We had then no Indian or colonial empire save the feeble germs of our North American settlements, which Raleigh and Gilbert had recently planted. Scotland was a separate kingdom, and Ireland was then even a greater source of weakness, and a worse nest of rebellion than she has been in after times. Queen Elizabeth had found at her accession an encumbered revenue, a divided people, and an unsuccessful foreign war, in which the last remnant of our possessions in France had been lost. She had also a formidable pretender to her crown, whose interests were favoured by all the Roman Catholic powers, and even some of her subjects were warped by religious bigotry to deny her title, and to look on her as an heretical usurper. On the other hand, Philip II was absolute master of an empire so superior to the other states of the world in extent, in resources, and especially in military and naval forces, as to make the project of enlarging that empire into a universal monarchy seem a perfectly feasible scheme. And Philip had both the ambition to form that project and the resolution to devote all his energies, and all his means, to its realization. Since the downfall of the Roman Empire, no such preponderating power had existed in the world. Philip had also the advantage of finding himself at the head of a large standing army in a perfect state of discipline and equipment, in an age when, except some few insignificant corps, standing armies were unknown in Christendom. The renown of the Spanish troops was justly high, and the infantry in particular was considered the best in the world. His fleet also was far more numerous and better appointed than that of any other European power, and both his soldiers and his sailors had the confidence in themselves and their commanders which a long career of successful warfare alone can create. One nation only had been his active, his persevering, and his successful foe. England had encouraged his revolted subjects in Flanders against him, and given them the aid in men and money without which they must soon have been humbled in the dust. English ships had plundered his colonies, had defied his supremacy in the New World as well as the Old. They had inflicted ignominious defeats on his squadrons, they had captured his cities, and burned his arsenals on the very coasts of Spain. The English had made Philip himself the object of personal insult. He was held up to ridicule in their stage plays and masques, and these scoffs at the man had, as is not unusual in such cases, excited the anger of the absolute king even more vehemently than the injuries inflicted on his power. Personal as well as political revenge urged him to attack England. Were she once subdued, the Dutch must submit. France could not cope with him, the Empire would not oppose him, and universal dominion seemed sure to be the result of the conquest of that malignant island. There was yet another and a stronger feeling which armed King Philip against England. He was one of the sincerest and sternest bigots of his age. He looked on himself, and was looked on by others, as the appointed champion to extirpate heresy and re-establish the papal power throughout Europe. A powerful reaction against Protestantism had taken place since the commencement of the second half of the 16th century, and Philip believed that he was destined to complete it. The reform doctrines had been thoroughly rooted out from Italy and Spain. Belgium, which had previously been half Protestant, had been reconquered both in allegiance and creed by Philip, and had become one of the most Catholic countries in the world. Half Germany had been won back to the old faith. In Savoy, in Switzerland, and many other countries, the progress of the Counter-Reformation had been rapid and decisive. The Catholic League seemed victorious in France. The papal court itself had shaken off the supineness of recent centuries, and at the head of the Jesuits and the other new ecclesiastical orders was displaying a vigour and a boldness worthy of the days of Hildebrand or Innocent III. Throughout continental Europe, the Protestants, discomfited and dismayed, looked to England as their protector and refuge. England was the acknowledged central point of Protestant power and policy, and to conquer England was to stab Protestantism to the very heart. Sixtus V, the then reigning pope, earnestly exhorted Philip to this enterprise, and when the tidings reached Italy and Spain that the Protestant Queen of England had put to death her Catholic prisoner, Mary, Queen of Scots, the fury of the Vatican and Escurial knew no bounds. The Prince of Parma, who was appointed military chief of the expedition, collected on the coast of Flanders a veteran force that was to play a principal part in the conquest of England. Besides the troops who were in his garrisons or under his colours, 5,000 infantry were sent to him from northern and central Italy, 4,000 from the Kingdom of Naples, 6,000 from Castile, 3,000 from Aragon, 3,000 from Austria and Germany, together with 4 squadrons of heavy armed horse, besides which he received forces from the Franche-Comté and the Walloon country. By his command, the forest of Wies was felled for the purpose of building flat-bottomed boats, which, floating down the rivers and canals to Mainport and Dunkirk, were to carry this large army of chosen troops to the mouth of the Thames, under the escort of the great Spanish fleet. Gun carriages, fascines, machines used in sieges, together with every material requisite for building bridges, forming camps and raising fortresses, were to be placed on board the flotillas of the Prince of Parma, who followed up the conquest of the Netherlands whilst he was making preparations for the invasion of this island. His intention was to leave to the Count de Mansfeldt sufficient forces to follow up the war with the Dutch, which had now become a secondary object, whilst he himself went at the head of 50,000 men of the Armada and the flotilla, to accomplish the principal enterprise, that enterprise which, in the highest degree, affected the interests of the pontifical authority. In a bull, intended to be kept secret until the day of landing, Sixtus V, renewing the anathema fulminated against Elizabeth by Pius V and Gregory Roman XIII, affected to depose her from our throne. Elizabeth was denounced as a murderous heretic whose destruction was an instant duty. A formal treaty was concluded, in June, 1587, by which the Pope bound himself to contribute 1,000,000 of scudi to the expenses of the war, the money to be paid as soon as the king had actual possession of an English port. Philip, on his part, strained the resources of his vast empire to the utmost. The French Catholic chiefs eagerly co-operated with him. In the seaports of the Mediterranean, and along almost the whole coast from Gibraltar to Jutland, the preparations for the great armament were urged forward with all the earnestness of religious zeal, as well as of angry ambition. For some time the destination of the enormous armament of Philip was not publicly announced. Only Philip himself, the Pope Sixtus, the Duke of Guise and Philip's favourite minister Mendoza, at first knew its real object. Rumours were sedulously spread that it was designed to proceed to the Indies, to realize vast projects of distant conquest. Sometimes hints were dropped by Philip's ambassadors in foreign courts that his master had resolved on a decisive effort to crush his rebels in the Low Countries, but Elizabeth and her statesmen could not view the gathering of such a storm without feeling the probability of its bursting on their own shores. As early as the spring of 1587, Elizabeth sent Sir Francis Drake to cruise off the Tagus. Drake sailed into the Bay of Cadiz and the Lisbon roads, and burnt much shipping and military stores, causing thereby an important delay in the progress of the Spanish preparations. Drake called this singeing the King of Spain's beard. Elizabeth also increased her succours of troops to the Netherlanders to prevent the Prince of Parma from overwhelming them, and from thence being at full leisure to employ his army against her dominions. Meanwhile in England, from the sovereign on the throne to the peasant in the cottage, all hearts and hands made ready to meet the imminent deadly peril. Circular letters from the Queen were sent round to the Lord Lieutenants of the several counties requiring them to call together the best sort of gentlemen under their lieutenancy, and to declare unto them these great preparations and arrogant threatenings now burst forth in action upon the seas, wherein every man's particular state in the highest degree could be touched in respect of country, liberty, wives, children, lands, lives, and, which was specially to be regarded, the profession of the true and sincere religion of Christ, and to lay before them the infinite and unspeakable miseries that would fall out upon any such change, which miseries were evidently seen by the fruits of that hard and cruel government holden in countries not far distant. The ships of the Royal Navy at this time amounted to no more than 36, but the most serviceable merchant vessels were collected from all the ports of the country, and the citizens of London, Bristol, and the other great seats of commerce showed as liberal a zeal in equipping and manning vessels as the nobility and gentry displayed in mustering forces by land. The seafaring population of the coast, of every rank and station, was animated by the same ready spirit, and the whole number of seamen who came forward to man the English fleet was 17,472. The number of the ships that were collected was 191, and the total amount of their tonnage 31,985. There was one ship in the fleet, the Triumph, of 1,100 tons, one of 1,000, one of 900, two of 800 each, 3 of 600, 5 of 500, 5 of 400, 6 of 300, 6 of 250, 20 of 200, and the residue of inferior burden. Application was made to the Dutch for assistance, and as Stowe expresses it, the Hollanders came roundly in, with 80 sail, brave ships of war, fierce and full of spleen, not so much for England's aid, as in just occasion for their own defence, these men foreseeing the greatness of the danger that might ensue if the Spaniards should chance to win the day and get the mastery over them, in due regard whereof their manly courage was inferior to none. We have more minute information of the numbers and equipment of the hostile forces than we have of our own. In the first volume of Hakluyt's Voyages, dedicated to Lord Effingham, who commanded against the Armada, there is given from the contemporary foreign writer, Meteren, a more complete and detailed catalogue than has perhaps ever appeared of a similar armament. The number of mariners in the said fleet were above 8,000, of slaves 2,088, of soldiers 20,000, besides noblemen and gentlemen voluntaries, of great cast pieces 2,600. The aforesaid ships were of an huge and incredible capacity and receipt, for the whole fleet was large enough to contain the burthen of 60,000 tons. The galleons were 64 in number, being of an huge bigness and very flately built, being of marvellous force also, and so high, that they resembled great castles, most fit to defend themselves and to withstand any assault, but in giving any other ships the encounter far inferior unto the English and Dutch ships, which can with great dexterity wield and turn themselves at all assays. The upper work of the said galleons was of thickness and strength sufficient to bear off musket shot. The lower work and the timbers thereof were out of measure strong, being framed of planks and ribs 4 or 5 foot in thickness, insomuch that no bullets could pierce them, but such as were discharged hard at hand, which afterward proved true, for a great number of bullets were found to stick fast within the massy substance of those thick planks. Great and well-pitched cables were twined about the masts of their ships, to strengthen them against the battery of shot. The galleasses were of such bigness, that they contained within them chambers, chapels, turrets, pulpits, and other commodities of great houses. The galleasses were rowed with great oars, there being in each one of them 300 slaves for the same purpose, and were able to do great service with the force of their ordnance. All these, together with the residue aforenamed, were furnished and beautified with trumpets, streamers, banners, warlike ensigns, and other such-like ornaments. Their pieces of brazen ordnance were 1,600, and of Iran 1000. The bullets thereto belonging were 120,000. Item of gunpowder, 5,600 quintals. Of match, 1,200 quintals. Of muskets and calivers, 7,000. Of halberts and partisans, 10,000. Moreover, they had great store of cannons, double cannons, culverings and field pieces for land services. This navy, as Diego Pimentelli afterward confessed, was esteemed by the king himself to contain 32,000 persons, and to cost him every day 30,000 ducats. While this huge armada was making ready in the southern ports of the Spanish dominions, the Prince of Parma, with almost incredible toil and skill, collected a squadron of warships at Dunkirk, and his flotilla of other ships and of flat-bottomed boats for the transport to England of the picked troops, which were designed to be the main instruments in subduing England. Thousands of workmen were employed, night and day, in the construction of these vessels, in the ports of Flanders and Brabant. The army which these vessels were designed to convey to England amounted to 30,000 strong, besides a body of 4,000 cavalry, stationed at Courtrai, composed chiefly of the ablest veterans of Europe, invigorated by rest, and excited by the hopes of plunder and the expectation of certain conquest. Philip had been advised, in the first instance, to effect a landing and secure a strong position in Ireland. His admiral, Santa Cruz, had recommended him to make sure, in the first instance, of some large harbour on the coast of Holland or Zealand, where the Armada, having entered the Channel, might find shelter in case of storm, and whence it could sail without difficulty for England. But Philip rejected both these counsels, and directed that England itself should be made the immediate object of attack. And on May 20th, the Armada left the Tagus, in the pomp and pride of supposed invincibility, and amidst the shouts of thousands, who believed that England was already conquered, but steering to the northward, and before it was clear of the coast of Spain, the Armada was assailed by a violent storm, and driven back with considerable damage to the ports of Biscay and Galicia. It had, however, sustained its heaviest loss before it left the Tagus, in the death of the veteran Admiral Santa Cruz, who had been destined to guide it against England. Philip II had replaced him by Alonso Perez de Guzman, Duke of Medina Sidonia, one of the most powerful of the Spanish grandees, but wholly unqualified to command such an expedition. He had, however, as his lieutenants, 2 seamen of proved skill and bravery, Juan de Martinez Recalde of Biscay and Miguel Orquendo of Guipuzcoa. On July 12th, the Armada, having completely refitted, sailed again for the Channel and reached it without obstruction or observation by the English. The orders of King Philip to the Duke de Medina Sidonia were, that he should, on entering the Channel, keep near the French coast, and if attacked by the English ships, avoid an action, and steer on to Calais roads, where the Prince of Parma's squadron was to join him. The hope of surprising and destroying the English fleet in Plymouth led the Spanish admiral to deviate from these orders, and to stand across to the English shore. But on finding that Lord Howard was coming out to meet him, he resumed the original plan, and determined to bend his way steadily towards Calais and Dunkirk, and to keep merely on the defensive against such squadrons of the English as might come up with him. It was on Saturday, July 20th, that Lord Effingham came in sight of his formidable adversaries. The Armada was drawn up in form of a crescent, which from horn to horn measured some 7 miles. There was a southwest wind, and before it the vast vessels sailed slowly on. The English let them pass by, and then, following in the rear, commenced an attack on them. A running fight now took place, in which some of the best ships of the Spaniards were captured. Many more received heavy damage, while the English vessels, which took care not to close with their huge antagonists, but availed themselves of their superior celerity in tacking and manoeuvring, suffered little comparative loss. Each day added not only to the spirit, but to the number of Effingham's force. Raleigh, Oxford, Cumberland and Sheffield joined him, and the gentlemen of England hired ships from all parts at their own charge, and with one accord came flocking thither as to a set field, where glory was to be attained, and faithful service performed unto their prince and their country. The Spanish admiral also showed great judgment and firmness in following the line of conduct that had been traced out for him, and on July 27th he brought his fleet unbroken, though sorely distressed, to anchor in Calais roads. But the King of Spain had calculated ill the number and activity of the English and Dutch fleets. As the old historian expresses it, "It seemeth that the Duke of Parma and the Spaniards, grounded upon a vain and presumptuous expectation, that all the ships of England and of the Low Countries would at the first sight of the Spanish and Dunkirk navy have betaken themselves to flight, yielding them sea room, and endeavouring only to defend themselves, their havens, and sea coasts from invasion, wherefore their intent and purpose was, that the Duke of Parma, in his small and flat-bottomed ships should, as it were, under the shadow and wings of the Spanish fleet, convey over all his troops, armour and warlike provisions, and with their forces so united should invade England, or, while the English fleet were busied in fight against the Spanish, should enter upon any part of the coast which he thought to be most convenient, which invasion, as the captives afterwards confessed, the Duke of Parma thought first to have attempted by the river of Thames, upon the banks whereof, having at the first arrival landed 20,000 or 30,000 of his principal soldiers, he supposed that he might easily have won the city of London, both because his small ships should have followed and assisted his land forces, and also for that the city itself was but meanly fortified and easy to overcome, by reason of the citizens' delicacy and discontinuance from the wars, who, with continual and constant labour, might be vanquished, if they yielded not at the first assault. But the English and Dutch found ships and mariners enough to keep the Armada itself in check, and at the same time to block up Parma's flotilla. The greater part of Seymour's squadron left its cruising ground off Dunkirk to join the English admiral off Calais, but the Dutch manned about 35 sail of good ships, with a strong force of soldiers on board, all well seasoned to the sea service, and with these they blockaded the Flemish ports that were in Parma's power. Still it was resolved by the Spanish admiral and the prince to endeavour to effect a junction, which the English seamen were equally resolute to prevent, and bolder measures on our side now became necessary. The Armada lay off Calais with its largest ships ranged outside, like strong castles fearing no assault, the lesser placed in the middle ward. The English admiral could not attack them in their position without great disadvantage, but on the night of the 29th he sent 8 fireships among them, with almost equal effect to that of the fireships which the Greeks so often employed against the Turkish fleets in their late war of independence. The Spaniards cut their cables and put to sea in confusion. One of the largest galasses ran foul of another vessel and was stranded. The rest of the fleet was scattered about on the Flemish coast, and when the morning broke, it was with difficulty and delay that they obeyed their admiral's signal to range themselves round him near Gravelines. Now was the golden opportunity for the English to assail them, and prevent them from ever letting loose Parma's flotilla against England, and nobly was that opportunity used. Drake and Fenner were the first English captains who attacked the unwieldy Leviathans. Then came Fenton, Southwell, Burton, Cross, Rayner, and then the Lord Admiral with Lord Thomas Howard and Lord Sheffield. The Spaniards only thought of forming and keeping close together, and were driven by the English past Dunkirk, and far away from the Prince of Parma, who in watching their defeat from the coast, must, as Drake expressed it, have chafed like a bear robbed of her whelps. This was indeed the last and the decisive battle between the two fleets. It is, perhaps, best described in the very words of the contemporary writer, as we may read them in Hacklight. Upon July 29th in the morning, the Spanish fleet, after the foresaid tumult, having arranged themselves again into order, were within sight of Grevelling most bravely and furiously encountered by the English, where they once again got the wind of the Spaniards, who suffered themselves to be deprived of the commodity of the place in Calais road, and of the advantage of the wind near unto Dunkirk, rather than they would change their array or separate their forces now conjoined and united together, standing only upon their defence. And howbeit there were many excellent and warlike ships in the English fleet, yet scarce were there 22 or 23 among them all, which matched 90 of the Spanish ships in the bigness, or could conveniently assault them. Wherefore the English ships, using their prerogative of nimble steerage, whereby they could turn and wield themselves with wind which way they listed, came oftentimes very near upon the Spaniards, and charged them so sore, that now and then they were but a pike's length asunder, and so continually giving them one broadside after another, they discharged all their shot both great and small upon them, spending one whole day from morning till night in that violent kind of conflict, until such time as powder and bullets failed them, in regard of which want they thought it convenient not to pursue the Spaniards any longer, because they had many great vantages of the English, namely, for the extraordinary bigness of their ships, and also for that they were so nearly conjoined, and kept together in so good array, that they could by no means be fought withal 1 to 1. The English thought therefore that they had right well acquitted themselves, in chasing the Spaniards first from Calais, and then from Dunkirk, and by that means to have hindered them from joining with the Duke of Parma his forces, and getting the wind of them, to have driven them from their own coasts. The Spaniards that day sustained great loss and damage, having many of their ships shot thorough, and they discharged likewise great store of ordnance against the English, who indeed sustained some hindrance but not comparable to the Spaniards' loss, for they lost not any one ship or person of account, for very diligent inquisition being made, the English men all that time wherein the Spanish navy sailed upon their seas, are not found to have wanted above 100 of their people, albeit Sir Francis Drake's ship was pierced with shot above 40 times, and his very cabin was twice shot thorough, and about the conclusion of the fight, the bed of a certain gentleman lying weary thereupon, was taken quite from under him with the force of a bullet. Likewise, as the Earl of Northumberland and Sir Charles Blunt were at dinner upon a time, the bullet of a demi-culverin brake thorough the middest of their cabin, touched their feet, and struck down 2 of the standers by, with many such accidents befalling the English ships, which it were tedious to rehearse. It reflects little credit on the English government that the English fleet was so deficiently supplied with ammunition as to be unable to complete the destruction of the invaders, but enough was done to ensure it. Many of the largest Spanish ships were sunk or captured in the action of this day, and at length the Spanish admiral, despairing of success, fled northward with a southerly wind, in the hope of rounding Scotland, and so returning to Spain without a farther encounter with the English fleet. Lord Effingham left a squadron to continue the blockade of the Prince of Parma's armament, but that wise general soon withdrew his troops to more promising fields of action. Meanwhile the Lord Admiral himself and Drake chased the Invincible Armada, as it was now termed, for some distance northward. And then, when it seemed to bend away from the Scotch coast towards Norway, it was thought best, in the words of Drake, to leave them to those boisterous and uncouth northern seas. The sufferings and losses which the unhappy Spaniards sustained in their flight round Scotland and Ireland are well known. Of their whole armada, only 53 shattered vessels brought back their beaten and wasted crews to the Spanish coast, which they had quitted in such pageantry and pride. Some passages from the writings of those who took part in the struggle have been already quoted, to which may be added the following description of the defeat of the Armada, written in answer to some mendacious stories by which the Spaniards strove to hide their shame. They were not ashamed to publish, in sundry languages in print, great victories in words, which they pretended to have obtained against this realm, and spread the same in a most false sort over all parts of France, Italy, and elsewhere, when shortly afterwards it was happily manifested in very deed to all nations, how their navy, which they termed invincible, consisting of 140 sail of ships, not only of their own kingdom, but strengthened with the greatest argosies, Portugal carracks, Florentines, and large hulks of other countries, were by 30 of Her Majesty's own ships of war, and a few of our own merchants, by the wise, valiant, and advantageous conduct of the Lord Charles Howard, High Admiral of England, beaten and shuffled together, even from the Lizard in Cornwall, first to Portland, when they shamefully left Don Pedro de Valdez with his mighty ship, from Portland to Calais, where they lost Hugh de Monsado, with the galleys of which he was captain, and from Calais, driven with squibs from their anchors, were chased out of the sight of England, round about Scotland and Ireland, where, for the sympathy of their religion, hoping to find succour and assistance, a great part of them were crushed against the rocks, and those others that landed, being very many in number, were notwithstanding broken, slain, and taken, and so sent from village to village, coupled in halters, to be shipped into England, where Her Majesty, of her princely and invincible disposition, disdaining to put them to death, and scorning either to retain or to entertain them, they were all sent back again to their countries, to witness and recount the worthy achievement of their invincible and dreadful navy, of which the number of soldiers, the fearful burthen of their ships, the commanders' names of every squadron, with all others, their magazines of provisions were put in print, as an army and navy irresistible and disdaining prevention, with all which their great and terrible ostentation, they did not in all their sailing round about England so much as sink, or take one ship, bark, pinnace, or cockboat of ours, or even burn so much as one sheepcote on this land.